You said, Hook, the HOA stormed in demanding my lake, but they didn't realize I secretly controlled their precious docks, and by the time they found out, it was already too late. The lake they wanted when Daniel first moved into the neighborhood. He thought he had found peace. After years of city noise, cramped apartments, and endless traffic, the idea of living in a lakeside home felt like paradise. The property stretched wide, with tall pines swaying in the breeze and water glistening like glass beneath the sun. To him, the lake was more than scenery, it was freedom, a reminder that quiet places still existed in the world. What Daniel didn't know was that paradise came with predators. The neighborhood, a well-kept community of manicured lawns and carefully painted fences, was controlled by the Homeowners Association. They prided themselves on maintaining standards and protecting property values, phrases that sounded harmless until you saw how they wielded them. The HOA was less a community organization and more a kingdom, ruled by a board that believed every square inch of the neighborhood belonged to them. Daniel had done his research before moving in. He knew the HOA existed, but what they never mentioned, and what the realtor quietly confirmed, was that his property came with a unique inheritance, unlike the others whose lots ended at their backyards. Daniel's deed extended all the way into the lake. Not just access, not just rights, but actual ownership of a portion of the water itself. It wasn't unusual in older developments. Years ago, before the HOA existed, the original landowner had parceled the lakeside differently, giving certain tracts direct control over water and shoreline. Daniel's was one of them. His slice of the lake was his alone. No board, no neighbor, no committee could touch it. On paper, he held more power than the HOA dared to admit. But the HOA didn't care about paper. They cared about control. The very morning after he moved in, before he had even unpacked the last box, they came. 3 board members, dressed in pressed polos and carrying clipboards, marched down his driveway with the confidence of generals inspecting conquered land. Their eyes weren't on his house, they were on the water. They spoke of shared responsibility and community use, but their intentions were clear. The lake, they said, belonged to everyone. It was the neighborhood's jewel, the board's pride, and Daniel's presence disrupted their vision. They wanted him to sign agreements, to cede management of the shoreline to their control, to surrender his slice of water as though it had never been his. Daniel said little that morning, but inside, anger stirred. He had barely arrived, yet already they were demanding pieces of his property, rewriting ownership as if his rights were an inconvenience. They mistook his quiet demeanor for compliance. They saw him as a newcomer, someone who would fold under pressure, someone who would learn quickly that the HOA always won. But what they didn't know, what none of them had even considered, was that Daniel's portion of the lake gave him leverage over something far greater than they realized. For while the HOA strutted about claiming dominion over lawns and fences, their true pride lay in the docks. Long wooden planks stretched from the shore into the lake, lined with boats, kayaks, and fishing gear. They were the HOA's crown jewel, a shared space that they touted in brochures, bragged about at meetings, and used as proof of their power. And every single one of those docks sat squarely in Daniel's water. He discovered it that evening, sorting through the pile of documents his lawyer had given him at closing. The maps were old but clear. The property line didn't just hug the shoreline, it extended out into the lake itself, covering a wide arc that included the entire stretch where the docks were built. On paper, the HOA's greatest treasure was nothing more than a cluster of trespassing wood anchored to Daniel's property. The realization sent a chill through him. The very thing they had stormed in demanding was already theirs only by theft. They believed they controlled the lake, but the truth was inverted. Daniel controlled them. He walked down to the water's edge, the setting sun reflecting off the ripples, and studied the docks. Children laughed as they jumped into the lake. Families lounged on folding chairs. Boats bobbed gently, tied to posts hammered into ground that legally belonged to him. To them, it was community property. To Daniel, it was leverage. The HOA had made their first mistake by storming into his life uninvited, demanding what wasn't theirs. They thought they had found another homeowner to bully, another rule breaker to fine into submission, but they hadn't counted on the quiet truth buried in the deed. The lake wasn't theirs. The docks weren't theirs. The power they flaunted belonged to Daniel, and Daniel alone. He didn't act that day. He didn't reveal what he knew. Instead, he let them believe their own illusion. Let them hand out warnings and bark about rules. Let them believe they were in charge, because patience was stronger than confrontation. And when the moment came to strike, Daniel would do more than protect his lake. He would dismantle the very heart of their control. The weight of the docks in the days following his first encounter with the HOA. Daniel kept to himself. Outwardly, he was the quiet new neighbor, settling into his home, trimming hedges, and painting the porch. He smiled politely at passersby and kept his head down when the board members drove slowly past his property, their eyes lingering on the lake as though it were theirs by divine right. But beneath that calm surface, Daniel was studying them, watching, listening, and learning how they operated. The HOA thrived on intimidation. That became clear almost immediately. Flyers appeared in his mailbox daily, reminding him of community standards and mandatory guidelines. The board sent him long lists of rules about lawn length, paint colors, and even where his trash bin could be placed. Each rule carried the threat of fines, escalating fees, or legal consequences if ignored. The goal wasn't order, it was submission. Neighbors whispered their frustrations quietly, but few dared to resist. The board had built its reputation on crushing dissent. One family had once fought over a fence color. Within months, they were buried under thousands in fines and liens, eventually forced to sell their house. Another had refused to trim a tree that the board claimed was unsightly, only to have legal threats pushed through until they gave in. Daniel listened carefully to these stories, each one weaving a picture of the board's arrogance. But he also noticed something else. Their pride, their center of gravity, always circled back to the docks. The HOA meetings were held near the shoreline, where they could gesture proudly to the long stretch of wood. They used the docks as a selling point to attract buyers. They had rules about who could use them, who could store boats, and who had the privilege of access. To them, the docks were not just planks and nails, they were the physical symbol of their authority. And Daniel owned every inch beneath them. At night, Daniel pored over the property maps. He highlighted the lines again and again, cross-referencing them with county records and aerial surveys. There was no doubt his deed included the entire section of water where the docks rested. Legally, they were trespassing. Legally, he could dismantle them. But Daniel wasn't reckless. Tearing down the docks overnight would spark open war. He needed precision, timing, and patience. The more he observed the board, the more cracks he saw in their armor. Their leadership wasn't united. The president, a sharp-faced woman named Carol, ruled with an iron grip, but the others seemed less sure. Daniel watched their meetings from a distance, noting how one board member often disagreed quietly, how another hesitated before signing off on new fines. They followed Carol's lead, but not out of loyalty, out of fear. Fear was a fragile foundation. Daniel also noticed how dependent the community was on the docks. Every weekend, families gathered there. Every evening, boats returned and tied up. The HOA controlled the lake by controlling access to those planks. But Daniel saw the truth. It was the docks that controlled the HOA. Remove them, and their power would collapse like a house of cards. So he began to plan. Step 1 was information. Daniel discreetly visited the county records office, confirming that the docks had been built without permits. The HOA had never sought approval, assuming no one would question their right. That arrogance was their blind spot. They had built their kingdom on someone else's land without even checking if they had the authority. Step 2 was leverage. Daniel began documenting everything: photos of the docks, maps with overlays, copies of his deed. He built a file thick, enough to bury them in paperwork if necessary. But he didn't want to use the courts. He wanted something quieter, sharper, something that would make the board crumble without ever realizing who had struck the first blow. Step 3 was patience. Daniel let weeks pass, letting the board grow bolder. They continued to send warnings, even threatening to fine him for the unauthorized landscaping near his shoreline. They still believed the lake was theirs. Each letter, each threat, only made his eventual strike sweeter. And then came the moment he had been waiting for. The HOA announced their annual Lakeside Festival, a grand event held every summer on the docks. It was their pride, their spectacle, the day when they flaunted control of the lake to every homeowner. Flyers plastered the neighborhood, boasting of music, food, and boat races. The entire community was expected to attend, and the board would stand at the center, basking in applause. Daniel smiled as he read the announcement. The docks would be filled, the HOA at their most confident, their most arrogant. The HOA at their most confident, their most arrogant. And all of it would be sitting squarely on land they didn't own, flaunting a power they didn't truly have. That would be the day the tide turned. He didn't need to rush, he didn't need to warn them. All he had to do was wait. Let them walk out onto wood that wasn't theirs. Let them boast from a platform they didn't control. And when the time came, Daniel would remind them who truly owned the water beneath their feet. The board had stormed in, demanding his lake. Soon, they would learn the truth. They were the trespassers, not him. And their empire stood on docks that could vanish as easily as they had been built. The festivalthe morning of the festival arrived with the kind of noise Daniel had grown to despise. The HOA had been preparing for weeks, and by dawn, the neighborhood buzzed with activity. Trucks unloaded folding tables, tents, and stacks of decorations. Volunteers strung up banners with the HOA's name plastered across them, each one proclaiming their dominion over the lakeside. Music speakers crackled as they tested sound systems, their echoes bouncing across the water. Daniel stood at his kitchen window, watching it unfold. The festival wasn't just an event, it was a performance. Every detail was designed to reinforce the board's image of authority. Families were expected to smile, to praise the work of the HOA, to believe the narrative that without the board's efforts, the community would fall into chaos. And at the heart of it all were the docks, polished and decorated with ribbons and flags. The centerpiece of the show. By mid-morning, the crowd gathered. Children ran along the shoreline with balloons, while adults clustered in small groups, chatting under the watchful gaze of the board. Carol, the HOA president, strutted across the docks like a queen surveying her kingdom. Every move she made radiated ownership, as if the water and would bend to her will. The other board members followed, their confidence inflated by the day's spectacle. Daniel moved quietly, unnoticed in the crowd. He didn't draw attention to himself. He was just another neighbor, smiling faintly, blending in. But inside, his mind was sharp and focused. This was the day he had been waiting for. He had already taken the necessary steps. For weeks, he had prepared his file maps, deeds, and permits, or rather, the lack of permits. He had spoken discreetly with county officials, ensuring the truth would surface at the right moment. He had even placed calls to the fire marshal and the zoning department, careful to phrase his concerns not as accusations, but as safety inquiries. The result was predictable. Curiosity turned into scrutiny, and scrutiny into official action. The festival had barely reached its peak when the first government vehicle arrived. A white truck bearing the county seal rolled up near the shoreline, drawing murmurs from the crowd. Two officials stepped out, clipboards in hand, their eyes scanning the scene. Carol noticed them immediately and strode over, her voice sharp, trying to assert control. To her, they were trespassers in her kingdom. To the crowd, they were a curiosity. To Daniel, they were the spark he had been waiting for. The officials began inspecting the docks. They measured posts, studied the water line, and compared notes. With the maps they carried, the atmosphere shifted. What had been a celebration turned tense, whispers spreading quickly among the residents. People asked questions, glanced nervously at one another, and wondered why the county had suddenly shown up on the board's prize day. Daniel lingered near the back, listening. He didn't need to speak. The truth was unfolding exactly as he had planned. The announcement came within the hour. The docks, the officials declared, were illegally constructed. They had no permits, no authorization, and worse, they sat on land that was not owned by the HOA. Every plank, every nail, every inch of wood extended into water legally deeded to Daniel's property. The festival, the boats, the board's pride, it was all resting on trespass. Gasps rippled through the crowd. Confusion turned to shock, and shock to anger. Neighbors who had once praised the HOA now demanded answers. Families asked if they had been paying fees for something the board didn't even own. Boat owners worried about access. Parents whispered about liability and safety. The board, caught off guard, scrambled to respond, but their polished smiles faltered. Carol tried to assert herself, waving her hands, insisting there was a mistake. But the officials stood firm. Without proper permits, the docks would be closed immediately pending further investigation. No boats, no swimming, no gatherings. The structures were unsafe and unauthorized. The words hit the crowd like a hammer. Daniel remained silent, but inside, he felt the satisfaction of a carefully set trap snapping shut. The HOA had chosen this day to flaunt their power, to demand loyalty. Instead, they had revealed their weakness for all to see. Their empire was built on stolen ground, and now everyone knew it. By late afternoon, the festival lay in ruins. The music stopped, the banners drooped, and the crowd dispersed in frustration. Families carried their children home, muttering about wasted time and fees. The docks, once alive with laughter, now stood empty, cordoned off with bright warning tape. The board members huddled together, pale and tense, their authority unraveling before their eyes. Daniel walked back to his house as the sun dipped low, the lake shimmering in golden light. From his porch, he could see the docks silhouetted against the horizon, abandoned and silent. What had been a symbol of power that morning was now a monument to arrogance. He had not shouted. He had not threatened. He had not even revealed himself as the hand behind it all. But he had struck, and the wound was deep. The HOA had stormed in demanding his lake. Now, for the first time, they realized the water was not theirs to command. And Daniel was just getting started. Cracks in the boarding the days after the festival collapsed. The neighborhood was buzzing with whispers. The laughter and music of that afternoon had been replaced with tense conversations at mailboxes, murmurs on porches, and sharp questions that spread from house to house. The HOA board, once untouchable, now found itself under scrutiny. The residents wanted answers. For years, they had been told their dues helped maintain the docks. They had been promised exclusive access, sold on the idea that their fees funded improvements, repairs, and insurance. But now it seemed the entire structure was built illegally. Not even on HOA land. People wanted to know where their money had gone and who was to blame. Carol, the board's president, tried to hold her ground. She sent out long letters filled with legal jargon, claiming it was all a misunderstanding. She promised the board would work with the county to resolve the issue. But the tone of her words was defensive, brittle, and it did little to calm the community. For the first time, her authority was being questioned openly, behind closed doors. The board fractured. Daniel could see it in the way they avoided each other at community gatherings, in the hurried arguments on the sidewalks. He didn't need to hear their words to know what was happening. The president pushed to fight, to claim dominance, but the others had been rattled. They hadn't signed up for lawsuits or public embarrassment. Their loyalty was waning, and Carol's grip was slipping. Daniel watched it all unfold with quiet patience. He knew the docks scandal was only the first crack. He had planted doubt in the community, and now it spread on its own, widening with every rumor, every unanswered question. But he also knew the board would try to recover. They would not give up their control so easily. It didn't take long. Within a week, the HOA announced their solution. They claimed they had entered negotiations with the county and promised to secure proper ownership of the docks. What they didn't say was that this meant coming back to Daniel. The board needed him now. Without his consent, they had nothing, and that realization must have burned them more than anything else. Sure enough, they appeared again at his property, not with clipboards this time, but with forced smiles and polite tones. They spoke of working together and finding a solution that benefits the community. They hinted at deals, even compensation, if he would just sign away rights to the water and allow the docks to remain under HOA management. Daniel listened silently, the same way he had when they first stormed in. But this time, he didn't even need to hide his amusement. The people who had once demanded his lake now came begging for it. Their confidence was gone, replaced with desperation. He didn't answer them, not yet. Instead, he let them leave with their nervous smiles cracking, their patience thinning. He knew better than to accept their first offer. They needed him far more than he needed them, and every day that passed made their position weaker. Meanwhile, Daniel continued to build his case. He gathered more documents, more evidence, not just of the dock's illegality, but of the HOA's financial mismanagement. He noticed patterns in the way fees had been collected, projects announced but never completed, repairs billed but not documented. To the residents, it looked like sloppy leadership. To Daniel, it looked like opportunity. The neighborhood grew restless. Parents grumbled about their kids losing access to the lake. Boat owners demanded refunds for fees they had paid to use the docks. Even those who had once been loyal to the board began questioning its purpose. For the first time, conversations about dissolving the HOA entirely began to circulate. Daniel didn't spread those whispers, but he didn't need to. He had set events in motion, and now the community was turning on the very people who had claimed to protect it. But Carol was not ready to surrender. If anything, the humiliation had hardened her. She doubled down on threats, sending letters about fines and contractual obligations. She tried to shift blame, accusing Daniel of causing the trouble, calling him uncooperative and selfish. But her words only made her look weaker. Everyone knew the docks had been built long before Daniel arrived. Everyone could see. She was trying to deflect from her own mistakes. Daniel remained silent, as always. He didn't need to fight her openly. Silence was more powerful. While she shouted, he waited. While she grasped at control, he stood firm on the deed that gave him real authority. And the more she fought, the more she revealed her desperation. The board was splintering. The neighbors were restless. The lake was his. And soon, Daniel knew, the moment would come when he would tighten his grip not just on the docks, but on the entire balance of power in the neighborhood. Leverageth neighborhood was no longer the same. What once had been a place of quiet conformity, held in line by the HOA's iron grip, was unraveling thread by thread. The docks still stood over the water, but they were lifeless, bound by county warnings and stripped of their glamour. What had once been a gathering place now looked like a scar. Daniel sat on his porch most evenings, watching the silence settle over the lake. The air carried less laughter now, fewer children's voices echoing off the water. The community was uneasy, caught in limbo between the HOA's flailing authority and the possibility of change. It was in that silence that Daniel began to make his move. He didn't storm into meetings. He didn't raise his voice. Instead, he carefully began to remind the community of what he already knew. The lake was his, and the docks belonged to no one but him. He did it with subtlety at first, slipping copies of county notices into the right mailboxes, sharing a few documents with trusted neighbors, letting whispers carry the truth further than he ever could alone. Soon, conversations began to shift. People no longer asked whether the board would fix the docks. They asked what Daniel planned to do with them. Some approached him directly, timid at first, curious about his intentions. He remained polite, careful not to overplay his hand, but he made sure they left with the understanding that the HOA had no claim. The docks were his decision to make, not theirs. That knowledge spread quickly, and with it came power. The board, once feared, now found themselves answering questions they couldn't control. Homeowners no longer cared about fines for lawns or fences. They cared about access to the lake. And every answer circled back to Daniel. Carol, the president, grew desperate. Her letters became harsher, more erratic. She accused Daniel of stealing community property, a claim that rang hollow given the mounting evidence against her. She threatened lawsuits, but the neighbors had lost faith in her. Even the other board members avoided her calls, unwilling to be tied to her sinking ship. Daniel chose this moment to act. He drafted a letter, short and precise, and delivered copies to every household. In it, he explained the truth plainly. The docks were built on his property without permission, and legally they could not remain. But instead of demanding their removal, he offered an alternative. If the community wished to continue using the lake and its docks, it would not be under the HOA's control. It would be under his terms. The reaction was immediate. Some were shocked, others relieved. Many saw his proposal as fair after all. It was his land, his water, and compared to the years of arbitrary rules and fines, Daniel's terms seemed almost generous. No fees funneled into mysterious accounts, no threats of liens or lawsuits. Just simple agreements made directly with him. The board, however, erupted in fury. Carol called an emergency meeting, her voice trembling with anger as she denounced Daniel as a usurper. She ranted about property values, about the sanctity of the HOA, about losing control. But as she shouted, Daniel's letter lay in the hands of her neighbors, quietly reminding them of the truth she could no longer hide. The more she fought, the more isolated she became. The board members began to resign, one by one, unwilling to face the storm. The community grew bolder, questioning why they needed an HOA at all when Daniel had already proven he could protect his property without their interference. And Daniel, he remained calm, letting the chaos swirl around him while he sat steady at its center. He didn't need to shout or threaten. His leverage was undeniable, written into the deeds and maps that gave him control of the water beneath their prized docks. By the end of the week, the HOA was hanging by a thread. The festival disaster had crippled their reputation, and Daniel's letter had finished what was left of their authority. What had once been a board that struck fear into every household was now reduced to a single, desperate voice shouting into the void. And Daniel wasn't done yet. He had one more move to make, one final step to ensure that the HOA never threatened him or anyone else in the neighborhood again. The docks had given him leverage. Now, he would use that leverage to end the board once and for all. The final strike. The HOA was finished in everything but name. The once mighty board, feared for its fines and threats, now stood hollow and powerless. Neighbors no longer trembled at their letters, no longer hushed their complaints. The silence that followed Daniel's letter had transformed into open defiance, and the board's grip had slipped beyond repair. Carol, the president, clung to the remnants of her authority with frantic desperation. She called emergency meetings, but fewer and fewer people showed up. She sent long, angry emails, but most went unanswered. Those who did reply demanded refunds, explanations, or simply mocked her in words she could not control. Daniel had remained silent during her unraveling, letting her exhaust herself in front of the very people she once ruled. But when he saw the last thread dangling, he knew it was time for the final strike. He filed a formal complaint with the county, not just about the docks, but about the HOA itself. Years of financial mismanagement, unapproved projects, and unpermitted construction were laid out in neat, meticulous order. Every document, every photo, every record of misused funds was presented with precision. He didn't exaggerate. He didn't need to. The truth was enough to bury them. The county launched its own investigation. Inspectors arrived again, this time not just for the docks, but for the HOA's books and operations. They asked questions the board couldn't answer. They requested records that had never been kept. The image of order and professionalism that the HOA had tried to maintain crumbled under the weight of scrutiny. The final blow came when the county issued a notice. The docks would be removed. They had been built illegally, and without Daniel's permission, they could not remain. Families gathered to watch as crews dismantled the planks, hauling away the very symbol of the HOA's power. By sunset, the shoreline was bare, the water calm and undisturbed. What had once been the board's crown jewel was gone, erased in a single day. The community stood divided in that moment, some saddened, others relieved, but all of them understood one truth: the HOA was finished. Without the docks, without their authority, without the illusion of control, there was nothing left to fear. Neighbors turned to Daniel in the days that followed, some cautiously, others with open gratitude. He never bragged, never gloated. He simply reminded them of what had always been true. His land was his lake was his, and the board had never had a claim. He offered access to those who asked politely, under simple agreements, free of the tangled fees and threats that had defined the HOA. It wasn't long before the board dissolved entirely. Members resigned, one after another, until only Carol remained, shouting into silence. Even she eventually vanished, her house sold quietly, her presence erased from the neighborhood she once ruled. In her absence, something strange happened. The neighborhood, freed from the constant grip of rules and fines, began to breathe again. Lawns grew naturally, not obsessively measured. Families gathered at the lake under Daniel's quiet permission, not the HOA's demands. People spoke more freely, laughed more often, and lived without the constant fear of a letter in the mailbox. Daniel had not only defended his lake, he had dismantled an empire. Not through shouting, not through reckless anger, but through patience, precision, and silence. He had turned their greatest weapon into their downfall, and in doing so, reshaped the balance of power. From his porch, he watched the sun sink over the bare shoreline, the water stretching wide and free. The docks were gone, the board was gone, and the lake was his once more. He hadn't just won a battle, he had ended the war. The HOA had stormed in, demanding his lake. But in the end, Daniel had taken far more from them. He had taken their crown, their kingdom, and their very reason to exist, and the neighborhood would never forget it.